I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we take a deep dive on topics that don't get enough coverage in the ordinary news, where we try to recover some lost history, where we try to explain the inexplicable, and we appreciate you joining us today. We've got a real treat for you. We have former FBI agent Thomas J. Baker. He's written a fantastic book called The Fall of the FBI. I recommend it to you. It has some tremendous endorsements and a fascinating story of his personal experience in the FBI, and then some conclusions, some recommendations on what can happen with the FBI now. Before we introduce Mr. Baker, I want to take a moment, first of all, to thank you for watching us on YouTube or listening to us on any of the podcast platforms out there like Spotify. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and then hit the bell so you get alerts when there's new additions to it. And also leave us a rating, and we appreciate any comments that you have. We want to know how we're doing and how we can improve the show and increase our viewership and our reach out to folks. So without further ado, Mr. Thomas Baker, welcome to On Watch.
Glad to be with you, Chris.
You've written a tremendous book, and it's gotten all kinds of really very positive endorsements from a lot of folks that I know and I respect, folks like Molly Hemingway and others. The book itself is called The Fall of the FBI. I encourage all of our viewers and listeners to go out and get a copy. It's really your experiences in the FBI. It's your professional life story, 33 years on active duty with the FBI. You were a legal attaché twice in Australia and in Paris. You've got a tremendous set of experiences, and we really appreciate you taking the time joining us today.
Glad to be with you, Chris.
So, Mr. Baker, let me ask you a question. You're a kid from the Bronx. I'm a Long Islander originally, and we both have Fordham as our alma mater, where we went for undergraduate work. Tell me, as you're a college student coming out of Fordham, how do you find yourself oriented towards the FBI? What kicked off your law enforcement career?
Well, as I explained in the book, my maternal grandfather had been a policeman in the city of Brooklyn way back when Brooklyn was its own city.
Right.
I never knew him, of course, but his two sons, my uncles, Bill and Frank, were both, among other things, they had a varied and long career in law enforcement. And I got to know and listen to both of them, their stories of law enforcement. So I always had an interest in law enforcement, an interest in justice. And I was which is not unusual in a young person, going to Fordham and as you know, back then, having philosophy and theology every year. I was somewhat naive. I certainly was idealistic and looking back on it, naive. And the New York City Police Department back then was beginning to recruit college graduates. So I signed up to join them. But I ran into some people, as I explained in the book. I won't go into all those details now, but as you probably read in the book, I was dissuaded from that. It was pointed out to me that I could join the FBI, and that's what I did.
Right. Your book is basically broken up into three sections: the good, the bad, and the ugly. So just give us a kind of an overview of each section. How do you describe, or how would you summarize those three chunks: the good, the bad, and then the ugly?
Okay. Well, as you may know, over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years, a lot of stuff has come to the surface about the FBI, and I wrote about it in op-eds and other commentaries in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And it's very ugly what has happened, and very hard for me. It's heartbreaking. But I didn't want the book to be a complete downer, a complete negative. So I came up with that theme: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is this wonderful career that I did enjoy, that I'm always thankful for. 33 years in the FBI, and then since then continued contact with the FBI and other parts of law enforcement. And in that time, I was on the periphery of some I won't say I was a major character, but I was involved in some cases of historical interest to everybody. The attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan, the TWA crash, the Pan Am 103 crash, and matters of that nature. So that's the good. I explain those adventures. I explain how things were. And in the course of telling these great stories, I was able to point out how the FBI had a concern for the Constitution and constitutional guidelines. Then the bad is my awakening, my maturity, that justice is not perfect, that there's a lot of injustice in the world. And several of those chapters in the bad, I talk about injustice. Bottom line is, which is no shock to most people, but it was to me, is that there are people in jail who really don't deserve to be there. And there's a lot of people who should be in jail who aren't.
Right.
And then the ugly is the last third of the book. And that's what's happened to our FBI with some possible ways forward and some possible solutions.
So it's been my experience that legal attaches, and you served twice as a legal attaché in 2 different American embassies overseas, you got to be smarter than the average bear. Yeah, you're not. They just don't take any guy off the street and say, "Congratulations, you're the legat." That's sort of the shorthand term, the legal attaché. How was it that you came to be selected for these 2 overseas posts?
Well, thank you for those well-camouflaged compliments. I appreciate it. And basically, back then, we didn't have as many legats as we shortly had thereafter. There were only then about 18 or 20 posts in the whole world. FBI having someone assigned in an American embassy began in World War II, and then it was just limited to London, Ottawa, Canada, and Mexico City. By the time I got there, when I was assigned to Paris, I was responsible for covering about half of Africa from Paris.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, when Louis Freeh was director, he created a number of new legal attaché posts throughout Africa, and we got a lot better coverage. It was a great experience. The Bureau sent me to school to learn French, which was a skill that became very handy, traveling around Francophone Africa and doing my business in France and in the Principality of Monaco. It was a great adventure. It was a great experience, but it put me up close to other government agencies, to political figures, and to other intelligence agencies, and I got to see their values and how they operated. And that, as you know, is a key part of the book.
Absolutely. Some tremendous stories in here, the good, the bad, and the ugly. A couple things always pop out at me that I just find curious. To me, the TWA Flight 800 story has never been successfully resolved. You kind of touch on that and say, well, maybe we'll never know, I guess, really. To me, it's just, I think it's a very great unsolved mystery with a lot of open questions hanging out there. And then, of course, I think that the nature of what was the counterintelligence mission, the FCI, Foreign Counterintelligence Mission at the FBI, has changed and morphed so drastically. 2 big phases to it, the post 9/11 world, and then really in the ugly part of your book, how it was twisted and used as a political weapon. So maybe a couple of seconds on TWA Flight 800, if you have any sort of insight or comment on that, because to me it's a great unsolved mystery. And then maybe if you trace the change in FCI work at the FBI and how that really got us to where we are now.
Well, you asked about that specific case, the crash of TWA 800.
Right.
I was a legal attaché in Paris when that happened. And of course, TWA 800 was bound for Paris from New York City, crashed came down from 14,000 feet because it wasn't at its full cruising altitude yet, about 6 or 8 miles, I believe, off the coast of Long Island. The case illuminates a lot of things. Number one, the importance of police cooperation domestically, which the New York City office of the FBI is really fantastic in that regard. They were on top of it. They had a long-term, close working relationship through the Joint Terrorism Task Force and others with the police, the New York City police, as well as the police in Suffolk County and Nassau County, Long Island, and others. They worked together on the crash site, did a marvelous job in recovering everything, reassembling the plane. In the meantime, though, the plane was bound for Paris. About 40 of the people on the plane were French citizens, and most of the cargo on the plane actually was being shipped by French citizens to various destinations in France. And as I go into some of that in the book, it was meticulous. We tracked down every package, we tracked down every passenger. Eventually, to help, there were only 5 of us in my little office in Paris. We got several shifts, relays of agents and police from the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York, helped us come interview all the victims' families in France, all the cargo shippers, and uncovered a lot of interesting and fascinating facts. And it was just a marvelous case in the sense that, I mean, it was tragic. People died.
Sure.
But it showed international and domestic cooperation in all the best possible ways.
I find the final conclusion terribly unsatisfactory, and I think it's remarkable. I was always very curious. I am a graduate of the farm, and my experience with the CIA is such that I can't think of another occasion when the CIA ever developed a video, modeling or a video example of their interpretation of how the plane broke apart and crashed. It's quite extraordinary, and I've never been satisfied with the conclusions of the investigation. I know that an awful lot of people spend an awful lot of time trying to get to the truth, and it's a frustrating sort of question mark left hanging out there.
Yes, and there have been numerous books written now, some of them fiction, obvious fiction, and some of them factual research on it. Is all I can say is that there was literally no stone left unturned. And I wanted to include that chapter in the book because there are certain aspects, as you now know, that I discovered, that I was around, that are not widely known, and I think they're worth telling and retelling. The humanity that was exposed in that, the efforts of a lot of people, and then the frustration that we had. There was an individual, he's deceased now, but quite famous at the time, P.S. Salinger, former press secretary for 2 U.S. presidents, and a man who was fluent in French, and he was going around France giving press conferences and alleging that the U.S. Navy shot down the plane, which is quite a calumny against the U.S. Navy. And we interviewed him several times, and we kept trying to find out the facts of it. It led to some very fascinating interactions, one of which I recount in the book. Simply the difference between the speed of light and the speed of sound and how that affects people's perception. Because there were dozens, as you know, obviously, dozens of witnesses along the shore on Long Island. They were looking up, and this plane's only 14,000 feet in the air, and it's only 6 miles off the beach. And they perceived things one way. They gave reports of a rising streak of light and then an explosion. So that was... We got a detailed explanation of that. A lot of fascinating stuff in that one investigation alone.
I agree. So now we fast forward quite a few years, and we see the arrival. I guess we can really look at it 3 ways. There's the Trump candidacy, the Trump the president-elect, and then the Trump administration. And there's what I believe to be some pretty aggressive and really gross overstepping of powers with respect to the FBI and their efforts to target people, not just Trump, but people like Michael Flynn, who, because of his background and experience, would have seen through what was going on at the FBI in about 20 seconds. And so here's my theory, here's my experience coming at this, and obviously Judicial Watch has litigated a lot of the details concerning this and getting the records about it. It appears to me that the FBI, for whatever reason, certain characters or people within it, decided to essentially run a penetration operation against the Trump campaign. And there's an explicit prohibition on that in Executive Order 12333, it's Section 209, which has to do with undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States. And so, in my view, the FBI manufactured a foreign counterintelligence event overseas in the UK using people like Carter Page and Papadopoulos. And once they manufactured that via Steph Halper and a few other operatives, the FBI could point at that situation and say, aha, we've got a foreign counterintelligence threat that's occurred, or the situation in the UK. And now we can import this investigation back into the United States under the cover of, oh, we need to pursue this, and we can run wild. And we can do all sorts of things with FISA warrants and just a very elaborate plan, which now we come to know as Crossfire Hurricane. So that's the Chris Farrell interpretation, and there's sufficient, I think, evidence to support that. And there's even little quippy remarks from Lisa Page and Peter Strzok where she text messages him and says, how did it go with your OCONUS lures, meaning outside the continental United States lures, which is shorthand for people that were used in a double agent operation. So there's all this sort of stuff that contributes to a pretty elaborate, it's a conspiracy, literally, on the part of FBI leadership. And, you know, the United States is suffering from it to this day. So, granted, not on your watch, not anything you had anything to do with, but you have wonderful sort of analysis of this. And so, based on my introduction, your experience, what are your observations or comments?
Well, Chris, first of all, you gave a very good synopsis of what happened, and essentially that is what happened. The investigation of the Trump presidential campaign, which the FBI codenamed Crossfire Hurricane, and I say this clearly in my book, there was no justification for opening that case whatsoever.
Right.
Now, the justification they pointed to, and the Mueller, the special counsel Mueller's report points to the same one item, and the culprits, like James Comey in his book, he has one paragraph on this. He points to the same information point for opening it, and that's a conversation, you alluded to this, a conversation in London, England, at a bar between Papadopoulos and another person, an Australian. And he's repeating, Papadopoulos, if you take it all at face value, he's repeating a secondhand rumor he heard that, quote unquote, the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton. Well, that would never have been, under any circumstances, enough predicate information to open a foreign intelligence investigation on any U.S. person, much less a presidential candidate or a presidential campaign. It just wasn't there. And on a side note, you're based in Washington, I believe, in the months leading up to any election, you could stand at any bar anywhere in Washington, D.C. and hear a half dozen crazy rumors. That's never been enough information to open an investigation. And I explain this in the book, but I can recall, because I was assigned twice, actually, for some length of time in the Washington field office of the FBI, we'd get an allegation about a congressman or a senator, or in one instance, I recall, a federal judge. And these, of course, for the most part, were bribery allegations, not intelligence matters. But we had to be sure we had enough probable cause. And I literally would be on the carpet in front of the director, because I was the assistant agent in charge in Washington field. And the director would be asking, do you have enough probable cause? Do you have anything more? We didn't go into frivolous investigations based on rumors. And that's what happened here. There was no justification for it, and I set that forth in my book. And now, 2 months ago approximately, the Durham report came out. Special Counsel John Durham did a report on the origins of the investigation, and essentially his conclusion is the same. It vindicates what's in my book. He says there was no justification whatsoever for opening that investigation.
Now, let me ask you a question. There's a lot of people who spend a lot of time, blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of attorney's fees, a lot of smear job in the press, and they've suffered, right? And you got people like Comey walking around, teaching college classes and having book tours. As you pointed out in the bad part of your book, hey, look, bad guys walk and good guys get screwed. Sometimes it happens. But this is really a systemic thing that has horribly, horribly tarnished a once proud agency. Does anybody really need to go to jail? Does somebody actually need to be prosecuted? Or does everyone just go, oh, well, mistakes were made?
Well, there's 1 or 2 or 3 crimes committed along the way, and at least one person, and maybe there might be others, will be indicted or face justice in that sense. For the most part, all of these things that happen, and you alluded to the General Flynn subset of them, they represent an abuse of authority, a terrible abuse of authority, which can only happen when an agency is permeated with this intelligence mindset where they can wander off willy-nilly. The key question, Chris, if you'll allow me, is how did this start? How did it begin? How did the FBI's culture get off track? And I submit to you that it traces back to Bob Mueller of Special Counsel fame.
Sure.
He became the FBI director just a few days before the September 11th attacks, which happened on a Tuesday. The following Saturday morning, Bob Mueller, brand new director, was summoned to Camp David, Maryland, where the president at the time, George W. Bush, was hunkered down with his key advisors, and he presented the report of the FBI's investigation thus far of the attack, which the FBI codenamed Pent Bomb. Only about 3.5 days elapsed between the attack on Tuesday and that Saturday morning. And in those 3.5 days, the FBI had done what it does best: investigate. And they had identified all 19 hijackers, their associates, their past travel, their financing, all their connections going back to Al-Qaeda. And when he was done with that report, he expected praise and thanks. And instead, George W. Bush just turned to him and said, I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one. Bob Mueller told us that he left that meeting bound and determined to change the FBI from a law enforcement mindset to an intelligence agency. He was going to change the culture, and he used that word. There may have been some justification for it at that moment in time, but it had a lot of bad consequences, which we're suffering from till this moment.
Clearly, that is, I've had Judicial Watch, of course, conducts its own investigations, and we've done some whistleblower work in places like a few, but let me pick one in particular that's egregious. El Paso, Texas. The El Paso FBI office, I'm not sure what the current situation is, but if you back up about 6-7 years, it was a rat's nest of agents just running amok, doing all kinds of crazy things. We've documented that. We've even filed some litigation on it. And it was the same mentality you're talking about. It was, the mentality shifted so that they became, I'll tell you, the instances of the people that I'm talking about, they were thugs with badges and guns. They had this mentality of, we can do whatever the hell we want, and if you don't like it, we'll arrest you. That was kind of the way they operated. And, who are they going to believe? Right? You're saying X, Y, and Z. but we're saying A, B, and C. And it was an extraordinarily arrogant approach. This was not law enforcement. This was not even, this was a mentality that permeated that particular office. And I think it was a reflection, really, as you've pointed out, of the leadership. I mean, these leadership failures, they start at the top and then they end up permeating everywhere, where people feel they can get away with stuff and they can do whatever they want. And, you know, if you don't like something, what are you going to do about it? Tough. No one's going to believe you. We're the FBI. And that really, I think, snowballed. Now, that's a gross generalization, and it's anecdotal based on some experiences we've had. But I really believe, based on this experience that we've had here and your own comments, that this really seeped down, that it became a systemic problem. And when I've talked and given, you know, public lectures in places, I've been very critical of this, and I've used other anecdotes that don't fit our current format today. But I've had some retired FBI agents come up to me and say, hey, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, Farrell. That's not my FBI. And they gave their experience of how they did 25 years in, you know, various places. And they were good guys and good gals. They, you know, they were going after bank robbers and, you know, all kind, the conventional legal process of law enforcement. But I'm telling you, and I guess you agree, there was something else going on. There was another agenda. There was another spirit that was moving in the organization that changed it radically. And there's really, in my experience, there's two FBIs. There's the good guys who are trying to do the right thing and go after some real creeps and animals, real criminals. And then there's the other guys, and they're doing something else. And it is a threat to the country. It's a threat to the Constitution, what they're doing.
Chris, you summed it up well, and you gave one or two examples. The change began by Bob Mueller, was exacerbated by the poor leadership of James Comey, for sure. And the difference is this in mindset and culture in an organization. In a law enforcement organization, you live and exist every day, consciously or unconsciously, for that day comes when you're going to have to stand up in court and raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, to a set of facts. Now, in an intelligence agency, first of all, in an intelligence agency, they deal in deceit and deception on a daily basis. And then their end product is an estimate, intelligence estimate. Some people would call a best guess. Guesses aren't allowed in the courtroom. So it changes the whole dynamics. And
right.
It's what allows now things that have come to the surface in recent months, really, where intelligence analysts in the FBI have come up with some freewheeling ideas. Number one, which is well documented now, censoring, monitoring the speech of Americans on social media, which many of us believe is a direct or an indirect threat to the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Amen.
Crackpot ideas like monitoring Catholics who might prefer to use Latin in worship, which again is a threat to the First Amendment's freedom of religion. These things have no grounding in the Constitution. There's no regard for the Constitution. And that's part of the reform, the change in culture we're talking about. We need to get the FBI back to where the key, to the primacy of the Constitution and operating within the guidelines and guardrails of the Constitution.
I agree with you 100%. I don't know that it's feasible or possible in the current environment or in the current configuration of the FBI. Certainly, the Justice Department now. What's frustrating to me is you have Durham come out in a 306-page report. Just today, some information out of the classified index or classified appendix, which has to do with FISA warrants. More information came out. And, he essentially admits, hey, look, crimes were committed, and the special counsel doesn't charge anything. I don't think anyone learns the lesson or anybody takes it seriously until major key decision makers are prosecuted. Comey, 245 times, had no specific recollection under oath. That's insulting. That's an affront, and that's the message to the public. Frankly, that's the message to bad guys, that there are no consequences for criminality. And I think the American public's gag reflex or its ability to just keep seeing that over and over again, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that the current state of affairs is not satisfactory.
Well, yes, and the reforms, and most of it has to be done inside the FBI, by the FBI, by the DOJ. But there is a role for Congress. There are concrete things that can be changed. You mentioned twice now FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Right.
FISA came into being in 1978, the same year that Judge Webster became the FBI director. And it was designed very specifically to provide a legal framework, a secret but legal framework, for the monitoring of foreign agents resident in the United States. So it had two real key ingredients. It was just to gather intelligence, which would be furnished to the national decision makers, i.e. all the way up to the president. And number two, it was only designed to be used against foreigners because it had a lower standard of probable cause than you have in the criminal process. And that worked for decades, from 1978 forward.
And if I could interject, and the idea was these foreigners are either engaged in espionage or terrorism.
Yes.
I mean, this wasn't we don't like you. It was they were bad guys up to real criminal mischief, either through spying or trying to kill somebody or blow something up. So it was a substantial threat to the country is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, and it started off, and these statistics get published after a year or two delay. It started off, there were only 200 FISA warrants that first year. You could probably guess who most of them were directed against. And it increased to, a few hundred incrementally. And it wasn't until after September 11th that it jumped up and we had 1,000 and 2,000 and 3,000 FISA warrants a year. But after September 11th, and since then, in a series of amendments and adjustments to the act, they've changed it so it can be used against Americans. They've also changed it. They've made it very much more permissive. It used to be that the FBI director and the attorney general had to personally sign each and every warrant. So they were closely scrutinized to be absolutely perfect. That's been expanded and expanded to now there's a dozen or more officials in both agencies that have the authority to make the final sign off on an application for a FISA warrant. Of course, the judge issues the warrant. So we now have it legally being used against Americans. That came to light in the Russian collusion investigation you alluded to, where you had 4 separate FISA warrants against Carter Page, a U.S. citizen. At the end of the day, it turned out he did nothing wrong. There was virtually no justification for monitoring him because it turned out, thanks to the John Durham report, it's confirmed that the only information they used to obtain the warrant was the stuff contained in the so-called Steele dossier, which was all fabricated information to begin with. So the thing was a terrible disgrace, a terrible abuse of a citizen's right. But, Chris, there are hundreds of FISA warrants we now know that, thanks to the Inspector General, every year directed against U.S. citizens. That's a disgrace. The Congress can change that with some simple amendments to restore FISA to its original intent. And I think that's a reform Congress should undertake.
2 important points on the Carter Page FISA that I just want to touch on, just to highlight that you mentioned. Number one, Carter Page actually had been a cooperative source He was part of a legal traveler debriefing program. And for folks that may not be familiar with that, there are all sorts of Americans, whether they're businessmen or academics, or they have reason to travel to someplace that's of interest to United States intelligence. And so these businessmen, they go, or businesswomen or whoever, academics, doesn't matter, but they're good, true, blue Americans who they go to places that are sometimes a little sketchy, a little curious. The country may be an opponent of ours in some way. And they're told, hey, listen, keep your eyes and ears open. Don't do anything. You're not supposed to play super spy. Just go and keep your eyes and ears open. And when you come back, tell us what you saw. Tell us who you met. Carter Page actively cooperated in that program. He was part of this illegal traveler debriefing program. So he was actually fully cooperative and being a good, true blue American. He was an Annapolis graduate. He was a naval officer. He wasn't, I mean, he may have been naive. He may have been sort of somewhere on the Asperger scale when it comes to his personality or whatever, but he was trying to do the right thing. And then, leave that alone for a second, Kleinsmith, who's an FBI attorney helping to prepare these FISA warrants, Kleinsmith lies. He does a record check with the CIA. They come back and say, no, this guy's a cooperating debriefer guy. He's a good guy. Kleinsmith changes that to make him a bad guy, literally changes the documentation, the report back from the CIA. Kleinsmith gets suspended from the DC bar for some pathetically short amount of time. I think maybe 3 months or something. And this guy, this attorney who willfully, knowingly fabricated documents to make a false submission to a court, to target an American, guess what? Kleinsmith is now back in full standing with the DC bar, practicing as an attorney. And that's what makes people crazy. It makes me nuts, but it makes ordinary citizens looking at this from the outside say, you know, this is a racket. These people are totally corrupt.
Well, Chris, you explained that very well. The Kleinsmith matter, that was one of the specific crimes that was a crime. But also, in the broader sense of the word, the FISA warrant against Carter Page and other FISA warrants against U.S. persons, and actually other special investigative techniques that were used against Papadopoulos and 2 or 3 others in this investigation, were abuses of authority. And it's just, these abuses are terrible. There's always been a guideline, and actually it exists in the criminal realm as well as in foreign counterintelligence, that you are always supposed to use a less intrusive means. And if an American, in this case Carter Page, indicates, or you have reason to believe they're cooperative and they would cooperate, you're supposed to just go out and interview them and use this lesser means to obtain whatever information you want. Of course, the fact that the report back from the Central Intelligence Agency to the FBI indicated Carter Page had cooperated with them in the past, that would have precluded any FISA warrant against him. That would have opened the door for the FBI doing a straight up approach to him and interviewing him.
Exactly. I mean, when in doubt, do a subject interview, right? Just walk in and talk to the guy, and you get an answer.
So they had to turn it around. And then the other information in the warrant, we know from the Durham report confirmed it, was all fabricated information, totally made up just from the Steele dossier. But beyond that, which people aren't dwelling on, the FBI received through FBI channels several instances of information that pointed towards the innocence or the non-violent involvement of Carter Page specifically and several others, and that information was buried. And that's another outrage.
It is crazy. So listen, in my estimation, you're a very brave guy, not just from your past career as an FBI agent, but the fact that you wrote this book, because I can virtually guarantee you that there's quite a number of people, probably the most recent leadership of the FBI, who don't like your conclusions and don't like that you have said, hey, look, this is a great agency, but it's now a threat to democracy. you're rare because there's an awful lot of people who just want to get their retirement and go get their bass boat and go off and do what they want to do. And you've stepped forward and you've said, no, this is wrong. And you've named names, you've proposed solutions. When you go to a FBI alumni lunch, are you warmly received, or what have you faced from as feedback from some of your contemporaries or some newer people?
Well, there are 2 or 3 people who consistently push back. They don't want to hear any criticism, and they're constantly making excuses for anything that happened. But the vast majority of people, including several people in the FBI that I'm still in contact with, have been very encouraging and have validated things. And beyond that, an interesting thing that's happened to me lately is I've done, no surprise, a number of book signings and book talks at Barnes & Noble and similar locales. And
Sure.
I have people walk up to me and identify themselves as current FBI employees or agents who have retired or resigned in the past year or two. And they tell me, Tom, it's worse than you think. And then they give me some specific examples. So I'm getting a lot of that feedback.
That could be a book unto itself.
Well, it's heartbreaking to hear some of this, but it does validate a lot of what I say in the book.
I can tell you from FBI employees who are contacts of mine who I've spoken to over the last few years, right up until a couple of months ago, I'm validating what you're saying 100%. People that have said, hey, look, I was in the Washington field office, I'm out of there. And then now they're off in Dayton, Ohio or someplace. I don't mean that literally, but they're way, way far away from headquarters because they wanted to go they want to go find bad guys and put them in jail. That's what they want to do. And they don't want anything to do with the Washington environment. And as you've said, there's other people who have come up and said, you think that's bad, and they unroll some story that would make your hair stand on end. Maybe not your hair, but other people's hair would stand on end because of the nature of what's going on. So listen, I'm going to just tell everyone this is the book itself. It's The Fall of the FBI. It's written by our guest, Thomas J. Baker. We're very appreciative of your time. Before we close out, I want to give you the last word. Anything that folks need to know, encourage them to get out here and get this book of yours. Anything else?
Well, of course, I encourage people to get the book. It's available on Amazon and other logical places where books are sold, or at my website, thomasjbakerbook.com. But Chris, I appreciate your time. I appreciate what you do. I appreciate what Judicial Watch does. We can never let our guard. We have to keep singing the song and pushing for reform. And hopefully, being an optimist, I believe there can be reform once people recognize what the problem is. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thomas J. Baker, author of The Fall of the FBI. Thank you for your service to this country, and thank you for the excellent book. We appreciate you taking time with us today.
Thank you, Chris.
I'm Chris Farrell, on Watch.